Hey everybody, this is a piece titled Climate Catastrophe, the quote, Zionist entity, end quote, and quote, the German guy, end quote, an anatomy of the Malm Jappe dispute by Matthew Bolton. This is going to be in the book Antisemitism in the 21st Century, edited by David Hirsh. In May 2021, a long-running and, at the time of writing, still unresolved legal dispute over the ownership of a number of properties in the Sheikh Jarrah area of East Jerusalem exploded into violence. Clashes between Israeli police and protesters at the Al-Aqsa Mosque were followed by thousands of rockets being indiscriminately fired at Israeli cities by Hamas militants in Gaza. In response, Israeli forces bombed targets in Gaza, with many civilian casualties. Intercommunal street violence between Jews and Arabs within Israel followed. Large protests were held against Israeli actions in Gaza in numerous cities in Europe and the United States. Multiple violent and verbal attacks on Jewish people, Jewish-owned shops, and synagogues were recorded in the wake of the protests. Social media was awash with posts, images, and memes, many using anti-Semitic concepts, signaling opposition to and moral condemnation of Israel. Comparisons between Israel and apartheid South Africa and police violence in the United States were widespread. In the middle of this febrile period, an online discussion panel was held by the, quote, Red May, end quote, collective in Seattle. The topic of the debate was COVID, climate, chronic emergency, antinomies of the state, and sought to explore different approaches to the state in the midst of the unprecedented interventions of the COVID era. The discussants were the sociologist Alberto Toscano, whose article on the topic was the inspiration for the debate, and the two theorists Toscano's paper had engaged with, Andreas Malm, whose pamphlet Corona, Climate, Chronic Emergency argued that, quote, war footing, end quote, the state had undertaken to tackle the pandemic should be extended to combat the climate crisis. And Anselm Jappe, I want to see something real quick. And Anselm Jappe, whose co-authored book, De Viris Illustribus, contended that state interventions aimed at, quote, protecting, end quote, a population, whether from COVID, climate change, or economic crisis, are all doomed to fail, because the state is an inextricable part of the capitalist social totality which caused the problems in the first place. The panel opened with Toscano's presentation before Malm was invited to make his contribution. Flexing a sculpted bicep behind his head, seemingly clad in a taqiyya prayer cap, Malm immediately announced that he had just unwillingly, quote, extricated, end quote, himself from a Palestine solidarity demonstration in Malmo in order to join the discussion, and, quote, confessed, end quote, that he was too choked with, quote, emotion, end quote, too, quote, seething, end quote, boiling, end quote, to focus on the topic at hand. The only thing Malm wanted to discuss, he said, the thing he could not, quote, stop himself from saying was, quote, how do we assess the current conjuncture in the Palestinian struggle for liberation? How do we express our admiration for the heroes of the resistance in Gaza, headed by Mohammed Deif, or Deif, D-E, Mohammed Deif, D-E-I-F? How do we understand the drift of the Zionist entity ever further into the extreme proto-genocidal right? End quote. Neither could he stop himself going on to ask, quote, how does this relate to general trends of fascistization in the global north? ... How do we learn the lessons from the Palestinian resistance and apply it as a model on other fronts, particularly the ecological crisis, end quote. At this point, Anselm Jappe intervened, declaring that he, quote, was not here to hear hate speeches against the Jewish state, end quote, and that if the discussion did not return to the proposed topic, namely COVID, climate, and the state, he and his co-authors would leave the Zoom panel. Malm responded with a withering, quote, oh yeah, you're German, right, end quote, before appealing to the moderator. Ajay Singh Chowdhury to adjudicate on whether anything he had said had been hateful, referring to his personal heritage as a, quote, Indian Jew, end quote. Chowdhury declared he found, quote, nothing hateful, end quote, in Malm's comments, and that Malm's focus on the Israel-Palestine conflict was, quote, germane, end quote, to the subject of the panel. Malm then continued, gesticulating with a pointed finger, arguing that chants of, quote, death to the Arabs, end quote, on, quote, the streets of Palestine, 1948 areas, end quote, demonstrated that Israel was on the verge of committing genocide, and that, quote, if you, Comrade Jappe, as a German, can't take this in, then that's your problem, end quote. Here, Jappe again interrupted to declare that, while he acknowledged Israel's actions in Gaza might be criticized as unduly, quote, harsh, end quote, he would no longer listen to, quote, somebody making an apology for anti-Semitic madmen from Hamas, end quote, and left the meeting. Acknowledging that, quote, the German guy, end quote, was no longer present, Malm apologized to the rest of the panel for, quote, scaring him off, end quote. But he could not, quote, betray my innermost sentiments, end quote, when it came to the question of Palestine. Malm then began to speak on the issue of the state and the climate, but repeatedly brought the discussion back to Israel, arguing that, quote, the generalized ignorance and indifference to what the science says is necessary, end quote, to prevent climate change. And the, quote, affirmation of the destruction of the, quote, world's tropical forest, end quote, is, quote, quite similar, end quote, to the world's ignorance and or affirmation of the, quote, destruction that's going on in Palestine right now, end quote. The reaction to the contretemps between Malm and Jappe within the small but by no means insignificant circles of the, quote, very online, end quote, radical left leaned heavily in support of Malm, just as it did within the panel itself. Neither Toscano nor the other panelists mentioned the incident, nor sought to defend, quote, the German guy, end quote, from Malm's attack. After the event, moderator Ajay Singh Chowdhury posted a Twitter thread congratulating Malm for showing how, quote, the Palestinian struggle is part and parcel of the global ecological politics of this moment in the 21st century, and that, end bracket, there are well and truly only two sides, and, end bracket, no way to magic beyond politics, which will be violent because conditions are already violent, end quote. Moreover, Chowdhury went on, quote, the actual moment of anti-Semitism in this panel was when Jappe identified Palestine solidarity and the critique of, quote, the Jewish state, end quote, as anti-Semitic. As has long been the case, Zionism itself is actually anti-Semitic. It loathes Jews as we really exist in the world as part of becoming an extension of the first of first the European imperial project as part of the logic mimicking Christian nation states, end quote. For his part, Jappe and his co-authors posted a short response on the Palim Sao website, writing that the event was, quote, another demonstration, to the point of caricature, that the upheavals of the Middle East have a sort of atavistic priority for leftism over any other subject, end quote. While it would be consoling to, quote, think that the discourse on, quote, left-wing anti-Semitism, end quote, was the exaggeration of a right that wanted to forget its past, end quote, sadly, quote, this is not the case, end quote. Why is this disagreement between Malm and Jappe worth recounting in such detail? Compared with the flood of anti-Semitism both online and offline that followed the escalation phase, the impact of a minor disagreement between two relatively obscure Marxian academics, although Malm has recently won an increasingly broad readership, to the extent that he has been labeled, quote, the first international star of eco-Marxism in the age of climate crisis, end quote, is surely of marginal importance. Quite so. And yet, the way the debate unfolded, its conceptual basis, the modes of argumentation, the terminology used, and the reaction to the debate tell us something important about how anti-Semitism plays out in the intellectual arena, and radical left spaces in particular. The divergence between Malm's and Jappe's positions is by no means arbitrary or contingent. Rather, it is the result of deep-seated theoretical differences between the distinct traditions of leftist thought that both, in an admittedly schematic way, can be said to represent. The theoretical differences that appear at the level of the relation of capitalism and the state, precisely those at stake in the initial debate on the state in the pandemic, play out in their respective analyses of anti-Semitism, Zionism, and the state of Israel. The debate can thus be recognized as a crystallization of contemporary forms of anti-Semitism within the left. Indeed, the manner of its unfolding and the response it generated will be grimly familiar to many of those who have sought to challenge that anti-Semitism over the past 2 or 3 decades. But it also alerts us to a new front in anti-Semitic discourse, namely the integration of the image of Israel into the center of what is rapidly and rightly becoming a central focus of leftist activism today, namely climate change and the critique of the, quote, Capitalocene, end quote. As such, the Malm-Jappe debate represents a real-time demonstration of how anti-Semitic worldviews adapt to new surroundings. The following section breaks the Malm-Jappe debate down into its component parts, seeking to uncover the conceptual basis of the disagreement. In so doing, it will demonstrate how many of the elements of contemporary anti-Semitism appear throughout this brief interchange. The latter section of the chapter will then interrogate the meaning of Malm's curt dismissal of Jappe's supposedly, quote, German, end quote, response. It traces the historical development of the so-called, quote, German, end quote, stance on anti-Semitism that Malm takes as given, and shows how Malm's contempt for such a position, one born of intense theoretical reflection and political struggle, unconsciously reproduces the position of a German right seeking to cast off Jewish-imposed guilt for the Holocaust in the name of a revitalized nationalist state. Moreover, the chapter concludes, the summary dismissal facilitated by the ascription of, quote, German, end quote, ness to Jappe here functions in much the same way as rejections of Jewish, or today, quote, Zionist, end quote, interlocutors on the grounds of their innate partiality, special pleading, or stubborn refusal to conform to new realities. As is often the case, then, such offhand comments reveal far more than the speaker intends. Israel, the enemy of, quote, the state, end quote. The most immediately striking aspect of Malm's intervention is its emotional tenor and frantic urgency. He admits he cannot hold his feelings back. He refuses to allow his, quote, innermost, end quote, passion to be restrained by the rigid formalities of, quote, professional, end quote, decorum or the demands of the topic at hand. From the streets of Malmo, his love for the Palestinians 2,000 miles away is such that it overrides any and every other priority, including that of climate change, and negates any attempt at rational debate. Indeed, the insistence on such abstract rituals is little more than a perpetuation of the oppression under which the Palestinians suffer. Noting, with David Nierenberg, that the opposition Malm sets up between Christian inward, quote, feeling, end quote, and, quote, honesty, end quote, and the cold formality and disingenuous politeness of Jewish law has been a mainstay of Western, quote, anti-Judaism, end quote, for centuries. It is clear from the outset that Malm's approach to the Israel-Palestine conflict is one driven by inexhaustible moral feeling that can brook no compromise or limitation. Indeed, it is not a conflict at all, if by, quote, conflict, end quote, is meant what Susie Linfield describes as a, quote, unresolved, frustratingly complex, grievously resilient struggle between two national movements, each with a justified claim to the land, end quote. Rather, for Malm, there is only one legitimate claim to nationhood, to statehood, to the land, and to morality itself, and it belongs solely to the Palestinians. Palestinian nationalism is ontological, concrete, eternal, and grounded in the soil. Jewish nationalism is transient, abstract, arbitrary, a transparently false concoction. This framing is re-emphasized by Malm's refusal to call Israel by name, instead referring to Israel as the, quote, Zionist entity, end quote. Israel is thus deprived of its statehood. It is not a true nation-state, but a usurper, a parody, clownishly aping what Chowdhury later describes as, quote, Christian nation-states, end quote, the true form of the state. The anti-Arab chants which Malm regards as the precursor to genocidal violence do not take place within Israel, that, quote, fictional, quote, entity, end quote, but rather on, quote, the streets of Palestine, the 1948 areas, end quote. No matter what international law says about the legitimacy of Israel's existence, for Malm, the, quote, Palestine, end quote, enduring eternally beneath the ersatz structures of the false Israeli polity, represents the, quote, true state, end quote, of the genuine, quote, people, end quote, of the region, one destined in time to be reunited again with its natural land. No doubt unconsciously, the contrast between the true state and false, quote, entity, end quote, that founds Malm's argument here replicates that made by Nazi ideologue Alfred Rosenberg in his 1922 pamphlet Der Staatsfeindliche Zionismus, or Zionism, the enemy of the state. For Rosenberg, writing long before the state of Israel came into existence, the very idea of a, quote, Jewish state, end quote, undermined the concept of, quote, the state, end quote, as such. The purpose of the state was to unite a national, quote, people, end quote, with the land to which it had an innate, natural, one might say, quote, indigenous, end quote, connection, and to protect that people from destructive outside forces. A, quote, Jewish state, end quote, was, from this perspective, a contradiction in terms. The Jews could not be considered a, quote, national people, end quote. They had no connection to any land, but rather existed as a global, cosmopolitan force, a, quote, anti-nation, end quote, whose presence undermined the integral unity of any true nation with the misfortune to host them. Should a, quote, Jewish state, end quote, come into existence, it would necessarily be a despised outlier, a pariah in the community of nations. It would act as the headquarters for the orchestration of the global conspiracy, seeking to disintegrate that system of true nation states of which it disingenuously pronounces itself a member. For Rosenberg, such a, quote, state, end quote, cannot be salvaged by political means. By its actions, it is rotten from the inside out, and can only be rejected in its entirety. The same insistence that Israel is an irredeemable, quote, historic error, end quote, an absolute wrong, reappears in Malm and Jappe contention that the Palestinian struggle against Israel is a microcosm of the fight to save the planet from catastrophic climate change. While in Malm's view, quote, true, end quote, states can and must act as the last line of defense against climate catastrophe by adopting a form of, quote, war communism, end quote, the Israeli state cannot. The, quote, Zionist entity, end quote, is a wholly exploitative and destructive political vehicle, beyond even communist redemption. This is because, as Malm set out in an extensive 2017 article for Salvage magazine, the quote relation between Palestine and climate change ... is more than one of allegory or analogy. Fossil fuels have been integral to the catastrophe from the very start, end quote. The existence of Zionism and of Israel itself, he suggests, has nothing to do with theology, anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, or the general rise of nationalism across the 19th century. Rather, the existence of Zionism and of Israel itself are the results of a ploy by the imperialist British to secure access to supplies of fossil fuels in the Middle East, and in particular oil, which was rapidly becoming, quote, the state-of-the-art fossil fuel, end quote, in the early decades of the 20th century. The project to establish a, quote, national home for the Jewish people, end quote, is presented here as a necessary precondition for 20th century capitalist development, and the destruction of the natural environment wrought by fossil fuel-based production that followed. The trajectory of the climate crisis is thus set to follow that of Israel itself. Climate change is forcing, quote, millions, end quote, of people around the world, quote, along the Palestinian axis, end quote, he writes. The entire planet is becoming Palestine. Malm's main evidence for this claim is the 1932 creation of a pipeline transmitting oil from Iraq to Haifa. Malm extols Arab attacks on the pipeline during the anti-British and anti-Jewish uprising of 1936 as a kind of clairvoyant climate activism avant la lettre. Strangely, he fails to mention that Zionist militants also attacked the pipeline a decade later as part of their own anti-colonial struggle, nor that the Haifa pipeline stopped functioning completely after Israeli independence was declared, and has never been reopened. Inconvenient history notwithstanding, the conflation of the existence of Israel and climate catastrophe is further underlined when Malm insists that since its establishment, Israel has facilitated, quote, American dominance over the Middle East and untrammeled access to its oil, end quote. Again, Malm omits to mention that Israel produces virtually no oil, while the Arab nations responsible for the great bulk of the world's oil production have been, until very recently, as implacably opposed to Israel's existence as Malm is. If the state of Israel personifies the rapacious destruction of the planet under the Capitalocene, end quote, then Palestine represents the wounded earth itself, the lost Eden poisoned by Zionist capitalist development. To quote, take up bracket the end bracket Palestinian position, end quote, Malm suggests, quote, is ultimately to choose nature as one's last and strongest ally, end quote. The salvage essay thus concludes by making a direct parallel between the Palestinian demand for the, quote, right of return, end quote, and that of the climate movement for a, quote, CO2 concentration, end quote, of, quote, 350 ppm, end quote. The desired result of these conjoined demands, he suggests, is to see, quote, Palestinians living in their own country, much like prior to 1948, end quote, acknowledging that the, quote, right of return, end quote, does indeed necessitate the eradication of Israel, and the, quote, CO2 concentration back below the levels of the late 1980s, from the river to the sea, CO2 emissions must first be eradicated and then turned negative, end quote. For Malm, the destruction of the state of Israel and the salvation of the planet, and thus of humanity itself, are one and the same process. The romance of reaction. Where's my water? I need some water. Given the urgency of the romance of reaction, given the urgency of the situation, it is no surprise that in Malm's view, just as the climate crisis necessitates any and every sort of direct action, so too should any mode of resistance to the, quote, Zionist entity, end quote, from whatever quarter and in whatever form, be unquestionably supported. Thus, in the Red May discussion, Malm does not express his solidarity with the Palestinians in Gaza facing Israeli attacks, or those in Sheikh Jarrah facing potential eviction, but explicitly extols, quote, the heroes of the resistance in Gaza, headed by Mohammed Daif, end quote. Mohammed Daif is the, quote, supreme commander, end quote, of the Izz ad-Din al-Qassam brigades, the military wing of Hamas, the fiercely reactionary authoritarian Islamist rulers of Gaza. Daif is thought to be the architect of the campaign of suicide bombings targeting Israeli buses and public spaces during the Second Intifada. Daif was central to the development of Hamas's artillery of Iran-funded Qassam rockets, those being fired indiscriminately at Israeli cities at the time of Malm's speech, as well as the network of tunnels aimed at allowing Hamas militants to enter Israel to perpetrate attacks. Since forcibly taking power in Gaza in 2007, Hamas has ruthlessly suppressed political opposition, public protest and trade union organization, with arbitrary arrest, abductions, torture, and extrajudicial killing of opponents a constant threat. The rights of women have been restricted, while gay people face persecution or even death. The deeply anti-Semitic content of the organization's founding charter, which draws heavily on the classic conspiracy theory of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, and of the material pumped out on its propaganda channels on a daily basis, needs little explication here. Malm's romanticization of such a reactionary political movement one which we can assume were it of a different, quote, people, end quote, he would not hesitate to assign to the, quote, general trends of fascistization, end quote, he diagnoses elsewhere, is typical of the Manichaean form of, quote, anti-imperialism, end quote, that has dominated the Western left since the 1960s. As is well known, this view of geopolitics begins with the unshakable premise that anything the United States, the UK, Israel, and their allies, the imperialists, a category which for Malm is interchangeable with the more activist flavored, quote, global north, end quote, do is to be a priori opposed, and any action by those who purport to oppose them is to be automatically supported, regardless of the political aims or methods of those opponents. Once a state or movement has been admitted to the side of the, quote, anti-imperialist, end quote, everything is permitted. Divisions that elsewhere would be regarded as critical to any social analysis, between left and right, capitalist and workers, secular and theocratic, ecological activist and climate change denier, are here dissolved into the homogeneous totality of the, quote, right side of history, end quote. Once history's backing is secured, there is no longer any moral difference between an autocratic theocracy and a secular democracy, or a nonviolent protest, an attack on a tank, the destruction of property, or blowing up a bus full of civilians with a suicide bomb. Malm's support for Hamas and for armed struggle is not mechanical or tinged with regret, but full-throated and celebratory. Indeed, Malm goes so far as to recommend the methods of Hamas as a model for climate change activists. Recall that these methods of, quote, resistance, end quote, including suicide bombings, indiscriminate rocket fire, and, in the words of Hamas official Fathi Hamad, speaking a week before Malm's Red May appearance, quote, cutting off the heads of the Jews, end quote, with, quote, 5 shekel knives, end quote, to, quote, humiliate the Jewish state, end quote. Give me 1 second. I have to look something up, because I think I might have a special comment to make. Okay, Andreas Malm is Swedish. I can't speak about Sweden, but I can speak about Norway. Norway, and I don't know the relationship between Sweden and Norway in terms of like their political countercultures, but in Norway, according to a piece that is on this YouTube channel about, I think it's the one that's titled "There Is No Progressive Nationalism," discusses the history of the left in Norway. And in Norway, and this may be the case of in Sweden as well, there was no anti-authoritarian phase of the student movement. The student movement came to Norway kind of late, but it immediately took on the kind of like Maoist third worldist guerrilla type of politics, like almost immediately, which whether it acknowledges itself as such, is a form of Stalinism, with all the inhumanity and authoritarianism that entails. And I can't really say if that's the case of the case in Sweden or not. But yeah, so there's probably a degree to which I don't know if it I don't know, but just an interesting aside. Far from distancing himself from such actions, the only time Malm's Salvage article voices any criticism of Hamas is for briefly considering abandoning violence in favor of a, quote, long-term truce, end quote, with Israel in 2015, as with a Jeremy Corbyn or a Andreas Malm, expressing public support for anti-Semitic political violence targeted at Jewish civilians seems to generate a vicarious thrill for a certain kind of leftist, a frisson of narcissistic wonder at one's own revolutionary toughness, pride at the cultivation of the hardened sensibility, and, quote, higher, end quote, morality necessary to accept whatever death and destruction is required in pursuit of the cause. But given Malm's clear authoritarian instincts, his Leninist, quote, war communist, end quote, state would even enforce mandatory veganism, and his explicit commitment to militancy, his bicep-flexing admiration for such, quote, heroic, end quote, resistance, not to mention the satisfaction he takes in, quote, scaring, end quote, Jappe from the panel, takes on a far more threatening hue than the vain and ultimately impotent posing of a Corbyn. It was, of course, Malm's statement of explicit support for Hamas and Daesh, and not, as Chaudhary later claimed, simple, quote, Palestine solidarity, end quote, which prompted Jappe's rejoinder, along with Malm's use of the term, quote, proto-genocidal, end quote, to describe Israeli attitudes towards the Palestinians. Despite the, quote, proto, end quote, qualification, the use of the concept of genocide in this context cannot but carry with it the full weight of the Holocaust, implicitly creating an analogy between the actions of the State of Israel, or the hopes of its population, and the Nazi extermination of European Jewry. It opens the pathway to the crude comparisons between Gaza and Auschwitz, or the Warsaw Ghetto, that are common within certain left spaces, as well as accusations of supposed Zionist collaboration with Hitler, or the graphic conflation of Zionism and Nazism in images that meld the Star of David with the swastika. These modes of Holocaust relativization, minimization, and victim blaming combine with older anti-Semitic notions of Jewish amorality. The idea that, devoid of Christian forgiveness, Jews are incapable of, quote, learning the correct moral lessons, end quote, from past suffering. The distinction between the situation in Gaza, anti-Arab racism within Israel, which certainly exists, and the annihilatory violence of the Holocaust is so great that to brandish the term, quote, genocide, end quote, in the context of a, quote, emotional, end quote, debate about the former amounts to willful incitement. The dismissive, even contemptuous reaction to Jappe's complaint from the rest of the panel, and from Chaudhary as moderator in particular, is also instructive, one worryingly familiar to anyone who has participated in debates about anti-Semitism, Israel, and Zionism in left spaces over the past 3 decades. Chaudhary's immediate response to the altercation was to mobilize his Indian Jewish background in order to give greater moral weight to his rejection of Jappe's concerns. In his later Twitter thread, posted presumably after more considered thought, Chaudhary reiterated that given he was, quote, the only Jewish person, I think, involved in that conversation, end quote, he could authoritatively confirm that it was not Hamas or their advocate Malm who were anti-Semitic, but rather Jappe, and indeed the entire notion of a, quote, Jewish state, end quote. That's definitely like a classic one. I mean, I don't know how people, this is just a personal thought, but I don't know how people, like, still, are engaging in these, like, fucking trash identity politics in terms of, like, gauging whether someone's, worldviews are emancipatory or not. I mean, Jesus fucking Christ. I mean, like, why does someone like Milo Yiannopoulos or Candace Owens, like, those people who explicitly weaponize their identity in order to, as in and of itself, justification for their own views on X, Y, and Z. Like, I don't know, like, I feel like that, like, for me, that's a joke. And the fact that people, like, that there's no one in the, like, no one, like, people on the left, like, still just kind of have this kind of things, like, well, as a woman, as this traumatized identity that I inhabit, that in and of itself makes me right about X, Y, and Z. Especially when it comes to topics of, quote, my people, end quote. Yeah. Sorry. The fact that, sorry. Moreover, not only does the anti-Semitic, quote, Zionist entity, end quote, embody the destruction of the natural world as Malm asserts, for Chaudhary, its, quote, neo-fascist ethnocracy, end quote, is, quote, the model for the global far right, end quote, today. Israel's, quote, neo-fascism, end quote, is not contingently tied, as some apologists might like to pretend, to the particular policies of the Netanyahu government, but rather, quote, dates back to the founding of the country, end quote. Zionism is fascism for Chaudhary, inherently, in its essence. Nor is it merely one manifestation of fascism today, but rather constitutes the fascism, the very ground upon which fascism rests. The logic of this argument is that those who claim to see anti-Semitism in some form of, quote, criticism, end quote, of Israel, such as, say, the claim that Israel is the only state on earth incapable of fighting climate change and so must be destroyed to save the planet, are defending fascism, colonialism, the destruction of the environment, and anti-Semitism itself. From a leftist perspective, such people cannot be regarded as comrades. Fucking right. And should thus be excluded from the left's, quote, community of the good, end quote. Oh, no, that's not. Okay, he's speaking for them. I'm talking about the other people. Sorry. From a leftist perspective, such people cannot be regarded as comrades and should be excluded from the left's, quote, community of the good, end quote. The vast majority of the Jewish population around the world fall into this banished category, by virtue of seeing some kind of relation between their Jewish identity and the state of Israel. However, despairing they may be of its current political trajectory, is unfortunate. But it is not anti-Semitic, so this argument goes, because a minority of Jewish people, like Chaudhary himself, or the members of Jewish Voice for Labour in the UK, do pass the left's litmus test on Israel. They are thus free to mobilize their identity to exonerate the left from the false accusations of anti-Semitism made by those Jews who do not. As David Hirsh puts it, this inverts the standard mantra of identity politics. Instead of claiming that their Jewish identity provides, quote, some special insight, partially hidden from those outside, to the nature of the racism that they suffer, end quote. Here, quote, membership of the targeted group gives them, ... special inside knowledge of the self-serving and dishonest claims made by the majority of Jews, end quote. Quote, you're German, right? End quote. Of course, as Chaudhary sagely points out, Anselm Jappe is not Jewish. He was born in Germany, moved to Italy as a young man to study philosophy, earned his PhD in France, became a professor, and now teaches in France and Italy. But for Andreas Malm, Jappe is simply, quote, the German guy, end quote. He thrust the label at Jappe 3 times throughout their argument. Quote, you're German, right? End quote. Quote, if you, as a German, can't take this in, then that's your problem, end quote. Quote, the German guy left, end quote. For the uninitiated, Malm's focus on Jappe's Germanness in this context might seem to be merely a distasteful xenophobic insinuation that his place of birth renders him incapable of recognizing or standing against genocide. That is indeed part of the work the label is meant to undertake. But for those more au fait with the topography of the contemporary Marxian left landscape, it is clear that Malm's, quote, German, end quote, accusation is a reference to the German left's supposed neurotic obsession with anti-Semitism and guilt-ridden mechanical defense of Israel. In the second half of this chapter, I want to unpick the concept of, quote, Germanness, end quote, in the accusatory, contemptuous form that is used by Malm, tracing its political and theoretical genealogy, and the function it fulfills for Malm in this debate. I want to say, I don't know if he'll get into this or whatever, but I would say that the German new left, especially after its anti-authoritarian stage, when it came to be represented by groups such as the Red Army faction, for example, and so on, was the most ferociously anti-Zionist to the point of being almost openly anti-Semitic. There was a bombing of a Jewish community center by a leftist group in Germany in the 70s as an act of solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. Also, the East Germany definitely gave weapons. There's a book called Undeclared Wars with Israel or something like that by the historian Jeffrey Hirsh. And basically, the East German government was giving weapons to Arab states, and I believe the PLO itself, in order to attack the Zionist entity. The quote Zionist entity, end quote. The idea that Germans, and especially left-wing Germans, are somehow especially, because they're German in and of itself, makes them especially sensitive or soft on Israel, is historically inaccurate. Even now, because there's especially because the anti-German movement or the anti-Deutsch movement, it's like anti-nationalist Germans who expressed open solidarity with Israel, as not in terms of anything that Israel may or may not do, but the principle of Israel and its right to exist. Because the organization exists and doesn't really quite have an explicit counterpart in other Western countries, it always needs to be kept in mind that segment of the left, at least to my understanding, has always been a minority. Like, pro-Israel sentiment among the German left has been rather limited, even if in comparison to other states they've had, in terms of other places, in relation to other places, that pro-Israel segment of the German left has had some influence, at least has at least been able to acknowledge the ways in which anti-Zionism can be anti-Semitic, even if they don't successfully convince people that anti-Zionism in and of itself is anti-Semitic. So that's just a thought. Because you saw this thing, I remember seeing this thing about, it was an interview with some German leftist by Tariq Ali, and it was something like that. It's like, he said, I wish I could do a nice British voice, but he said something to the effect of, German young people today have no reason to feel guilt for what their grandparents did in World War II that should keep them from making Palestine, the issue of Israel-Palestine, central to their politics. And it's like, dude, you don't like, one of the most famous slogans from the New Left in Germany was strike the Zionists dead, paint the Middle East red. Yeah. Anyway, back to the reading. To do so means acknowledging from the outset that the left in Germany today is indeed a global outlier when it comes to anti-Semitism and attitudes to Israel, although the more familiar anti-Zionist positions are by no means absent and may slowly be becoming dominant. This idiosyncrasy is reinforced by, and to an extent responsible for, Germany's state-led Erinnerungskultur, or, quote, culture of remembrance, end quote, in which the post-reunification state has made Holocaust memorialization and education a central plank of its existence. I'm going to say that I disagree with Bolton here in terms of, I would say that he's right to say that the German left is an outlier in terms of at least a certain segment of it being more warm to the very existence of Israel than other groups on the international left. But I wouldn't say that. I would say that it seems to me that the anti-German movement and the anti-Deutsch movement and all those kind of anti-nationalist German anti-nationalist groups on the German left, they were a response to the mainstream of the German left, which did not subscribe to the politics that they adopted, including solidarity with Israel. Third worldist reactionary anti-imperialism was as prominent in Germany as everywhere else. So I would say that it's not, I'm sorry, I should just read the thing, but it's just going from what he said, he's kind of giving the idea that, the German left is the German radical Marxist left is warm towards Israel, or the German radical left has been warm towards Israel, and now it's becoming less warm towards Israel. I would say that that kind of the history of how the German left is related to Israel has been infinitely more complicated than them. Especially if you consider the relics of East Germany being part of the German left, then definitely I would say that anti-Zionism has been way more prominent in the German left than that brief remark by Matthew Bolton would suggest. Anyway, the most notorious representation of this tendency is the, quote, anti-Deutsch, end quote, faction. The, quote, anti-Germans, end quote, who rose to brief prominence through the 1990s and 2000s. They became renowned and despised within international leftist circles for waving Israeli flags at demonstrations, disrupting meetings of the anti-Zionist left and confronting pro-Palestinian protesters. But a reticence to subscribe to the absolutist anti-Zionism that is the price of entry to the left in the rest of the world is shared by a much wider constituency within the German left than the few activists explicitly affiliated to what remains of the anti-Deutsch. Okay, he's basically saying what I'm saying. I should have let him finish talking before I start talking. But far from this being an unthinking, quote, German reflex, end quote, such positions were by no means inevitable, but rather the result of long struggles, at the level of both theory and practice, not only within the left itself, but within Germany more broadly. While aspects of these debates carried specific German resonances, much of what was and is at stake, questions of the meaning and significance of the Holocaust, and how it fits into the broader relationship between anti-Semitism, genocide, the state, nationalism, and capitalist modernity, was and remains of central importance wherever those forms exist. Given this, the contemporary global left's failures on anti-Semitism, from minor incidents like the Malm and Jappe debate to the major crisis precipitated by Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the British Labour Party, can be, in part, attributed to ignorance of, or a failure to understand or engage with, the theoretical and political basis of the German debate, or to take on board the lessons which can be applied in non-German contexts. A failure that Malm's sneering, quote, German guy, end quote, dismissal neatly demonstrates. Theoretically, the so-called, quote, German, end quote, position on anti-Semitism can be traced back to the critical theory of anti-Semitism developed by Theodor W. Adorno and Max Horkheimer. In the early years of the Nazi era, Adorno and Horkheimer had subscribed to a version of the orthodox Marxian analysis of anti-Semitism, whereby anti-Semitism was explained as a form of ideology consciously and cynically propagated by the ruling class to distance from and thus further their oppression of the working class. Anti-Semitism here is merely an interchangeable means to a more fundamental end, class domination. But by the early 1940s, the centrality rather than contingency of exterminatory anti-Semitism to the Nazi project had begun to become clear, and Horkheimer and Adorno revised their position. Moreover, it was evident that support for anti-Semitic policies, stretching from economic boycotts to ghettoizations, deportations, and eventual annihilation amongst, quote, ordinary, end quote, Germans, including workers, was not half-hearted or forced, but enthusiastic and authentic. Explaining this embrace of anti-Semitism across society as a whole meant understanding how anti-Semitism arose from, or was embedded within, the very foundations of that society, in its concepts, its collective psyche, its mode of existence. In Dialectic of Enlightenment, and throughout the rest of their career, Horkheimer and, in particular, Adorno sought to identify the roots of anti-Semitism and of Auschwitz in the interplay of universality and particularity, identity and non-identity, rationality and myth across the long development of Western society. While there were historical particularities that meant that Germany was the place where exterminatory anti-Semitism reached its climax, Adorno argued that the fetishized rationality and identity imposed by the compulsory exchange relations of capitalist modernity, and feelings of powerlessness in the face of vast state bureaucracies, technological domination, and the ceaseless turmoil created by the capitalist world economy, created unprecedented conditions for the exacerbation and political activation of an anti-Semitism that was never far below the surface. As such, he famously argued in Negative Dialectics that, quote, Hitler has imposed a new categorical imperative upon humanity in the state of their unfreedom, to arrange their thinking and conduct so that Auschwitz never repeats itself, so that nothing similar ever happen again, end quote. I kind of say that, the categorical imperatives, in my day-to-day life, I said, a good starting point for political wisdom, I suppose, is the three different categorical imperatives. The first of Kant being Kant's, which says the categorical imperative to treat humanity, both in yourself and others, as an end in and of itself and not merely as a means. So don't instrumentalize people, don't use people. The second categorical imperative would be that of Marx, for humanity to throw overall conditions in which human beings are a debased and despised, mutilated being. I don't know the exact words. And then Adorno's categorical imperative to arrange their thinking and conduct so that Auschwitz never repeats itself, so that nothing similar happen again, end quote. In the decades following the end of the war and the construction of the Federal Republic of West Germany, this, quote, never again, end quote, imperative entailed constant vigilance against the anti-Semitism that Adorno suggested remained latent within West German state and society. While the Federal Republic was a democracy and thus qualitatively distinct from the totalitarian authoritarianism of the Nazi regime, it is fragile and had been imposed from the outside, rather than fought for by the Germans themselves. Adorno argued that in such a context, the rise of newly, quote, sanitized, end quote, i.e. no longer explicitly anti-Semitic, right-wing parties meant that, quote, the survival of National Socialism within democracy, bracket, was now, end bracket, potentially more menacing than the survival of fascist tendencies, i.e. explicit neo-Nazi parties against democracy, end quote. In particular, Adorno focused on the dangers of what he termed, quote, secondary anti-Semitism, end quote, whereby attempts are made to minimize the events of the Holocaust, to mitigate the guilt of the perpetrators, to suggest the victims in some sense instigated or provoked their treatment, or to accuse the victims of seeking to profit, either financially or politically, from the past by continually bringing it up, enforcing a national, quote, guilt complex, end quote, that prevented Germany from moving on. All right, I'm going to take a break. For all Adorno's influence within German leftist circles until his death in 1969, his critique of the latent fascism within the Federal Republic and his demand that, quote, never again, end quote, should in Auschwitz be allowed to happen, became subject to interpretations by a new generation of leftists that, in the kind of dialectical twist his own work diagnosed, turned his entreaties on their head, as he privately recognized. In the late 1960s and 1970s, radical left groups within Germany began to regard the Federal Republic as not merely potentially, but actually fascist, a position Adorno explicitly rejected, while U.S. foreign policy, particularly the brutal war in Vietnam, was routinely characterized as a direct extension of the Nazi regime. This conflation of U.S., quote, imperialism, end quote, perhaps better understood as a paranoid, destructive anti-communism, with the Holocaust effectively amounted to a relativization of the Holocaust, born of a failure to grasp the crucial conceptual distinction between mass murder and extermination, quote, the administrative murder of millions of innocent people, end quote. Conflating the two categories, in much the same way as the German right sought to equate the bombing of Dresden with the gas chambers, implicitly exonerated the older generation of Germans who lived through the Nazi era. If Vietnam was genocide, a new Auschwitz, then neither the Nazis nor the German people need suffer from any exceptional form of guilt. Yeah, I think Bolton is right to emphasize the crucial distinction between mass murder and extermination. It's people like to throw around the term genocide very loosely whenever there's mass violence induced by one state against another. But I don't think conflating the two of mass murder or mass violence by a state against mass state violence and deliberately trying to exterminate an entire group are two different things. Yeah. Like, for example, something like 15 to 40 million people died in the Great Leap Forward in China. But it seems like it would be a mistake to call that mass atrocity genocide, as if the purpose of the Great Leap Forward was to exterminate a segment of the population on ethnic, religious, or other grounds. That seems, I feel like it's important to keep that in mind. There has to be other factors besides just violence or mass violence to qualify something as genocide. Back to the text. Moreover, for the German New Left is elsewhere, Israel's surprise victory in the 1967 war against various Arab states, seemed to make it clear that Israel too was part of the imperialist project. Just one more fascist, Nazi state that had to be defeated by any means necessary to, quote, prevent another Auschwitz, end quote. In fact, as Paul Berman puts it, for much of the German radical left, Israel had become the, quote, crypto-Nazi site par excellence, the purest of all examples of how Nazism had never been defeated, but had instead lingered into the present in ever more cagey forms. What better disguise could Nazism assume than a Jewish state, end quote. The parallels with Chad Hari's claim that from the moment of its founding, Israel has been the model for post-Nazi fascism are clear. In the wake of 1967, German student movements passed Malm-esque resolutions condemning the, quote, Zionist entity, end quote, as a, quote, bridgehead of imperialism, end quote. Guilt over the death of 6 million Jews, it was argued, should not prevent the recognition of the, quote, daily, end quote, Kristallnacht Israel was imposing on the Palestinians. German revolutionaries traveled to the Middle East to train with Palestinian militants. Direct actions against Jews and Israeli targets followed. In 1969, the day after the anniversary of Kristallnacht, a Jewish community center in Berlin, built on the site of a synagogue burnt down during Kristallnacht itself, was bombed by a splinter leftist group. Following the desecration of Jewish graves with the words, quote, Shalom plus napalm, end quote. In 1972, renowned left militant Ulrike Meinhof heralded the murder of 11 Israeli athletes in Munich as an attack on, quote, Israel's Nazi fascism, end quote. One brilliantly conducted on the very German soil where the seeds of Israel's criminal existence were first sown. 4 years later, German activists helped members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, a group whose campaign of plane hijackings, hostage-taking, and bombings continues to be romanticized by the contemporary left. As Malm does in his Salvage article, hijack a plane flying from Tel Aviv to Paris. Landing in Entebbe, Uganda, the hijackers scrupulously separated the Jewish and Israeli passengers from the rest, who were freed, and threatened them with death unless their demands were met. A secret mission by Israeli commando units eventually rescued the abductees. The grotesque spectacle of German leftists taking part in gunpoint, quote, selections, end quote, of Jews including at least one survivor of the extermination camps, barely 30 years after the Holocaust was finally too much to take. Discussions within leftist circles, at both intellectual and activist levels, began to reappraise the assumptions underpinning the conflation of U.S. foreign policy, Israeli, quote, imperialism, end quote, and the Nazi extermination of the Jews. The notion that anti-Semitism was not limited to the far right or to the ruling class, but was embedded within society as a whole, including, so it seemed, the anti-capitalist left, needed to be taken seriously again. One second, gotta blow my nose. Marx, Pistone, and Romantic Anti-Capitalism. For parts of the German left, the tools needed to reappraise Marx, Pistone, and Romantic Anti-Capitalism. For parts of the German left, the tools needed to reappraise the relationship between anti-Semitism, capitalist society, and ostensible opposition to that society were found in a return to Marx. In the midst of the late 1960s activist explosion, a new strand of Marxian theory emerged, heavily indebted to Adorno, and sought to reconstruct Marx's critique of political economy from the original text, rejecting the distortions imposed by decades of Soviet and official Communist Party filtering. To rather unwisely attempt to summarize an incredibly rich body of literature in a few lines, instead of critiquing capitalism from the perspective of the working class, this, quote, new reading of Marx, end quote, sought to delineate the social forms that structure capitalist society as a whole, including the standpoint of the working class, the commodity, capital, value, and money. The movement of these forms, it was argued, creates social conditions, which makes survival dependent on the constant production of ever-increasing value through labor and commodity exchange. These general conditions are out of the control of any particular social actor, no matter how peaceful. The capitalist's need for more and more profit, a requirement that, as Malm rightly recognizes, lies at the heart of today's climate crisis, is not, at root, due to the personal immorality of capitalists, although immoral capitalists no doubt exist. Rather, it is the inescapable result of a society in which the production of life itself is inextricably tied up with the reproduction and expansion of value. Far from the state being the means by which this society can be opposed, as it is for Malm, from this perspective, one shared by Anselm Jappe, whose work draws heavily from the value-critical tradition, the state is, quote, the political form of bracket capitalist end bracket society, end quote, itself, and thus dependent on the continued reproduction of that society. The validity of a particular state in this society does not rest on any ontological connection between a, quote, people, end quote, and a, quote, land, end quote. The basis of Malm's rejection of the, quote, Zionist entity, end quote, and romanticization of supposed Palestinian ingenuity, but the extant state's ability to defend its borders, quell internal unrest, and integrate its citizens into the capitalist world market. Romantic nationalism does not explain the underlying, quote, origin, end quote, of the state, but is rather a consoling fantasy, a secondary response to the division, contradiction, and conflict that constitutes a society founded on the movement of capital, an attempt to transcend fragmentation through the imposition of national unity. There are no grounds in such a perspective to reject a Jewish state, aside from the rejection of the state form as such, which thereby precludes support for a state of Palestine. The most influential attempt to use commodity form theory to comprehend anti-Semitism and the Holocaust came in the shape of Moïse Pastone's seminal 1986 essay, Anti-Semitism and National Socialism. Here Pastone, who had previously studied in Frankfurt, argued that Nazism should be understood as a romantic form of anti-capitalism, in which the positive, quote, concrete, end quote, aspects of capitalist society, manual labor, industrial production, the nation-state, were opposed to the intangible yet destructive, quote, abstract, end quote, elements. Money, finance, interest, rootless cosmopolitanism. The dramatic, confusing and often traumatic transformations of everyday life wrought by the development of capitalist society were blamed on the contamination of the national community of producers by international finance, interest, and money. This, quote, truncated, end quote, critique of capitalism, which does not recognize with Marx that in capitalist society the concrete, use value, and abstract, exchange value, are the necessary preconditions for one another, opens up the pathway to a modern racialized mode of anti-Semitism, in which the abstract dimension of capitalism is, quote, biologized, end quote, or concretized as, quote, the Jews, end quote. For the Nazis, Pastone writes, quote, the Jews were not seen merely as representatives of capital, end quote. The standard Marxist critique of anti-Semitism, but, quote, became the personifications of the intangible, destructive, immensely powerful, and international domination of capital as an alienated social form, end quote. The attempt to exterminate the Jews was therefore an attempt to salvage the concrete element of capitalism from capitalism's abstract deformation in the shape of the Jews. The connection Pastone makes between, quote, quote, personalized, end quote, critiques of capitalism and anti-Semitism can only ever be one of possibility, not necessity. The association of Jews, in particular with the secretive yet all-dominating power represented by, quote, unproductive, end quote, finance, interest, usury, and so on, cannot be explained by the mere existence of a worldview which opposes those phenomena to, quote, concrete, end quote, productive labor. Rather, it requires historical analysis of the deep imbrication of anti-Judaism within the conceptual foundations of Western and Christian culture. Moreover, even within the history of anti-Semitism itself, the exterminatory drive of the Holocaust remains an outlier, demanding explanation at a level of concrete specificity that is beyond the reach of critical theory. Nevertheless, at an abstract level, the basic building blocks of the Nazis' anti-Semitic worldview, a romantic anti-capitalism, based on the fetishization of the state as the first line of, quote, protection, end quote, of a national community of producers from destructive global forces, available for political mobilization within a society shaped at a very deep level by centuries of anti-Jewish thought, are visible in many other cases, including leftist movements. Wherever these elements are present, the possibility of anti-Semitism is too. In a later article, Pastone built on this analysis to argue that the contemporary, quote, anti-imperialist, end quote, left, still reliant on a Manichaean worldview left over from the Cold War, now fetishizes the, quote, abstract and dynamic domination of capital, on the global level as that of the United States, or, in some variants, as that of the United States and Israel, end quote. The state of Israel here takes on the hated personified form of abstract domination once fulfilled by, quote, international Jewry, end quote. It is precisely this position which underlies Malm's support for Hamas and abhorrence for the, quote, Zionist entity, end quote. For both Malm and Chowdhury, Israel is a, quote, concretization, end quote, of the abstract domination of global capital responsible for climate change. Hamas, on the other hand, represents the rebellion of the concrete against the abstract, the true nation pitted against a legalistic fiction in a last-ditch attempt to salvage nature itself from that, quote, foreign, dangerous, destructive force, end quote, which threatens the entire planet. For Pastone, this fetishization of movements like Hamas or Hezbollah and the rationalization of their anti-Semitism and terroristic forms of, quote, resistance, end quote, as a perhaps regrettable but understandable reaction to Israeli aggression, fatally misunderstands the nature of anti-Semitism in contemporary Arab societies. The widespread prevalence of classical protocol-style conspiracy theories about Jews here is not due to some supposed backwardness of the, quote, Muslim world, end quote, nor, in the main, to the actual actions of Israel, but rather a consequence of the inability of Arab states to adapt to the demands of neoliberal capitalism. The struggles for democracy that erupted in the Arab Spring was one response to these failures. Blaming economic decline on a world conspiracy led by all-powerful, quote, by all-powerful, quote, Zionists, end quote, another. So I got to reread that sentence, I fucked it up. The struggles for democracy that erupted in the Arab Spring was one response to these failures. Blaming economic decline on a world conspiracy led by all-powerful, quote, Zionist, end quote, another way of dealing with these failures. The latter constitutes for Pastone, quote, a populist anti-hegemonic movement that is profoundly reactionary and dangerous, not least of all for any hope for progressive politics in the Arab/Muslim world, end quote. For the Western left to fail to make any distinction between these two responses, to conflate them both in a single romantic narrative of, quote, resistance, end quote, is, for Pastone, a sign of the left's, quote, helplessness, end quote, the total loss of its political and moral bearings. Pastone's initial article on the anti-Semitic potential of romantic anti-capitalism was in part stimulated by what he perceives as the German left's failure to recognize the significance of, or challenge, the 1985 visit of neoconservatives U.S. President Ronald Reagan and West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl to the Bitburg Cemetery for a memorial ceremony at the graves of Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS servicemen. Reagan justified his visit by arguing that German military conscripts, including some in the SS, were as much victims of Nazism as those who died in the camps, and later suggested that Germany had had for too long, quote, a guilt feeling imposed on them, end quote, that was, quote, unnecessary, end quote. Polls showed that more than 75% of the West German population supported the visit. The following year saw the outbreak of the famous Historikerstreit, or, quote, historians' quarrel, end quote, in which a succession of right-wing German historians argued that Germany needed to make a, quote, clean break, end quote, with its Nazi past and reject the burden of historical responsibility in order to construct a modern, self-confident national identity. The Nazi era was not the responsibility of the German people as a whole, they suggested, but was the result of a criminal gang taking the nation hostage. Nor were the crimes of the Nazis historically exceptional, but differed only in technicalities from those of the Soviet Union. Indeed, Nazism was in many ways a rational, if misguided, response to the Bolshevik Revolution. Moreover, the loss of the German Reich and the forced transfer of German populations from Eastern Europe after the war was a, quote, secondary Untergang, end quote, downfall, ruin, to match that of European Jewry. For Pistone and other Frankfurt School figures such as Jürgen Habermas, this amounted to a concentrated right-wing attempt to, quote, normalize, end quote, and thus sanitize both Nazi anti-Semitism and the Holocaust itself in the name of a new German nationalist project. The urge to exonerate and reconcile Germany to its past, to cast off a guilt which, it was implied, was being forced on it by external forces, was an expression of the kind of, quote, secondary anti-Semitism, end quote, Adorno had identified 20 years previously. Indeed, for those on the German right, less sheepish than the August historians about explicitly identifying who, precisely, was responsible for, quote, imposing, end quote, a guilt complex on the German people, the culprits were, and remain, clear. Israel and its Zionist supporters were exploiting the memory of the Holocaust to extract a moral, political, and financial ransom from the German state. This argument was later universalized by Norman Finkelstein in his book The Holocaust Industry, published by the leftist Verso Books. For Finkelstein, Israel and its supporters do not merely instrumentalize the Holocaust to seek political and financial reward from Germany, but are attempting to blackmail the entire planet. In Pistone's view, the failure of the German left to muster any substantive protest against the Bitburg visit or critical intervention in the Historikerstreit, while hundreds of thousands of German leftists thronged the streets in protest against U.S. actions in South America, was a manifestation of the same repression and relativization of the Nazi past expressed by the right. Unless predicated on, quote, an open, ongoing confrontation with and rejection of the Nazi past, end quote, he warned, left attempts to force Germany to break with the United States and with NATO, or to seek to recapture the spirit of a pre-Nazi German left radicalism, risk sanctioning a, quote, traditional German rejection of the West, coupled with a return to those Teutonic virtues which have in the past made Germany the scourge of the earth, end quote. There can be no, quote, new, end quote, or radical, quote, alternative, end quote, Germany, unless it is, quote, defined constantly and consciously in opposition to the determinate old of the German past, end quote. It was within this context that the, quote, anti-German, end quote, movement emerged in the wake of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the rising specter of German reunification. On the one side was a right wing pushing the idea that the creation of a new German national identity necessitated the downgrading of the Holocaust, the sanitization of the Nazi era, and opposing, implicitly, Israel's supposed hold over German politics. The prospect of a new Germany, casting off the last remnants of historic guilt for the Holocaust in order to take its position on the world stage once more, dominating Europe politically and economically, was, for the anti-Germans, one ripe for a revived far right. On the other side was a left who sanctioned the right's attempts to sanitize the Nazi past by dissolving it into universal theories of class struggle or imperialism, who denied the legitimacy of Jewish nationalism, and Jewish nationalism alone, and for whom opposition to Israeli, quote, imperialism, end quote, meant, at best, turning a blind eye to anti-Semitism, or, at worst, the fetishistic romanticization of reactionary anti-Semitic political movements. In contrast, the anti-Germans sought to disrupt the ominous, quote, atmosphere of, quote, German informality, end quote, and rediscovery, end quote. End quote, insisted on the commemoration of the Holocaust and the confrontation with Germany's National Socialist past as backbones of any left-wing project, end quote. The victory of a left and a reunified Germany that took anti-Semitism seriously in this context was by no means guaranteed. The formation of a new German state with a memorialization culture at its heart, symbolized by the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin, rather than one premised on the reconciliation to the past. The relativization of the Holocaust and the rejection of historical responsibility was in great part a triumph for the left, a victory over what might have become a dangerous reprisal of aggressive German nationalism, however pyrrhic for a left opposed to the notion of nation-states per se. To naturalize the result of this process, one informed in part by radical critiques of capitalist society, in part by concrete struggles against attempts from both right and left to sanitize German history and the significance of the Holocaust, so as to reduce it to an innate, quote, German reflex, end quote, is to ignore other potential outcomes that were no less, and in many ways more, likely, as well as the continuing, and indeed rising, dangers of anti-Semitism within Germany today. It is to also ignore the many divisions within the anti-Zionist left in Germany. Second. It is also to ignore the many divisions within the anti-Zionist left in Germany since the initial emergence of the anti-German current. Ironically, in 2001, Jappe himself wrote a stinging criticism of the anti-German's trajectory. He argued that the movement had reverted to a form of inverted German nationalism, moving away from a position which sought to understand the particularities of German history in the light of the general development of capitalist modernity, to one that fetishized the unique evil of German identity at an ontological level, relativized the Holocaust by labeling figures like Saddam Hussein or Yasser Arafat, quote, new Hitlers, end quote, and romanticized Anglo-American capitalism. Quote, just as the anti-Semite wants his capitalism without Jews, end quote, he suggests. Quote, so the anti-Semite wants his capitalism without anti-Semitism and thinks he can find it in the USA, end quote. A mistake that Adorno, for one, never made. Quote, there are only two sides, end quote. But for Andreas Malm, none of this complex and contested history matters. Just as the equally complex and contested history of the Middle East is flattened into an eschatological fantasy of a noble, quote, Palestine, end quote, battling a demonic, quote, Zionist entity, end quote, so too does Malm's reified figure of, quote, the German, end quote, erase the ongoing process of theoretical work and political struggle that lies behind Jappe's refusal to leave unchallenged his praise for Hamas. For Malm, Jappe's position is one not born of considered reflection about the relationship between capitalism, anti-Semitism, and Israel, about the deep imprint of anti-Judaism on the foundations of Western thought, or recognition of the dangers of political movements seeking to blame Jews or Israel for the negative effects of capitalist modernity. Rather, it is merely an irrational product of, quote, the German guys, end quote, roots. From this perspective, Awareness of the continued power and pan-political appeal of anti-Semitism as an explanation and consolation for the turmoil of capitalist society is little more than an inherited pathology, a constitutive weakness, cowardly and laughable, something to be easily, quote, scared off, end quote. For Malm, this deformed heritage is expressed in an innate character type, absurdly sensitive, partial, dogmatic, and admonitory, which plays out psychologically, theoretically, and politically, an identity which Jappe cannot escape. However far he physically lives from the German Gemeinschaft. It is thus enough for Malm to publicly reveal Jappe's, quote, German, end quote, ness, for everything about the latter's intellectual and political position to be explained, and thereby dismissed without further consideration. That this dismissal functions at a structural level in much the same manner as the anti-Semites' dismissal of, quote, the Jew, end quote, and, quote, the Zionist, end quote, is perhaps only a coincidence, but it is an unfortunate coincidence nevertheless. Malm's contempt for the, quote, German guy, end quote, is shared by that other Germany, the Germany that drops entirely out of sight in his analysis, a Germany that has long sought to reconcile to rather than reject its past, and to overcome guilt and historical responsibility in the name of a reinvigorated nationalism. For this Germany, the continued failure to recreate the, quote, true state, end quote, demanded by the radical imaginary can be blamed on those outsiders seeking political and financial gain through the imposition of a guilt complex. And the cowardice of those Germans who submit to such demands, those, like Jappe, without the pride and fortitude needed to finally, quote, close the books on the past, end quote, and move on. For Malm, of course, it is not the restoration of an old Germany that is supposedly blocked by the cynical leveraging of historical suffering for present political and financial gain, accompanied by endless, groundless, manipulative cries of anti-Semitism, but the creation of a new Palestine. And as his impassioned writings and intervention makes clear, for Malm, this Palestine to come, premised on the destruction of the, quote, Zionist entity, end quote, will not be merely one more state among many, but rather the symbol of an emancipated world, the harbinger of a reconciled nature and a redeemed humanity. As so many times in the past, here a stubborn, recalcitrant Jewish particularity is presented as the obstacle to the restoration of natural harmony. Quote, there are well and truly only two sides, end quote, in this struggle for salvation, and the fact that all but a slither of the world's Jewish population find themselves, once again, cast as the misfortune of the world is something that cannot be helped. Thanks for listening.